Pilot calls police on Black Boy, instantly regrets it, when his dad, Big Shaq, exposes the pilot's intentions. A simple sketchbook becomes fuel for a confrontation no one expected. Big Shaq steps in with trademark calm and unmistakable authority, but what unfolds isn't just a correction, it's a reckoning about fear, bias, and the power of speaking truth. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. One small glance in the wrong direction started it all. It was just after 9 a.m. on a mellow Thursday, the kind of morning that airports were made for. Bright skylights casting lazy sun patches on the polished floors, muted flight announcements floating overhead like background music. Shaq held Big Shaq. O'Neill leaned back in the black leather seat of Terminal B-23, legs stretched, frame unmistakable even in a plain navy hoodie and jeans. Beside him sat his 12-year-old son, Devon, nose buried in his sketchbook, headphones slipped around his neck, pencil dancing over the paper. Shaq had learned to exist quietly, in public spaces. No photos, no handshakes unless offered. Always polite, always gracious, always watching. But today wasn't about anyone else. It was about this flight, this time this rare window of undisturbed fatherhood. They were headed to D.C. for a youth education summit where Shaq would speak about opportunity and discipline, and Devon would tag along as his shadow. He wanted the boy to witness more than crowds and cheers. He wanted him to see what impact looked like when the lights were off. Devon was humming to himself, low and content. His sketchbook flipped open to a new page, airplane wings in progress, the kind of stuff that came naturally to him. He liked drawing things that moved, especially things that flew. "I'm gonna go sit closer to the windows," Devon said, eyes still on his art. Shaq looked up from his phone, paused and nodded. "Right where I can see you. No earphones in." Devon gave a salute, stuffed his earbuds into his hoodie pocket, and walked a dozen feet toward the large glass windows. He sat cross-legged near the edge, pencils spilling gently beside him. No one noticed him at first, or maybe they did, and didn't care. But that changed. It started subtly. A woman with a carry-on glanced up from her magazine, and stiffened slightly. A man with a coffee in one hand paused his walk, eyes lingering a beat too long, before he moved on. And then there was the pilot. Preston Mavell stood at gate B-25, 38 years old, clean-shaven, crisp uniform, and the air of someone who demanded control in every room he entered. He'd noticed Shaq earlier, but said nothing. Celebrity sightings didn't interest him. But now he saw Devon, sitting alone, hood up, sketching with intensity. Something about it unsettled him, though he couldn't, or wouldn't explain why. He leaned over to the gate agent, whispered something, then started walking toward the opposite side of the terminal with his phone in hand. Shaq had been watching this out of the corner of his eye. He knew the rhythm. The glances. The misplaced tension. It had played out too many times in too many different ways. He stood up slowly, not drawing attention, and walked a few steps closer to where Devon sat. He didn't want to spook his son. Devon was finally in his zone, sketching a landing gear with impressive detail. Shaq noticed the way the boy's brow furrowed in focus, his grip on the pencil light, but deliberate. Just then, a uniformed airport security officer passed nearby, gaze scanning the gate area with a particular purpose. He didn't look like he was patrolling casually. Shaq's eyes narrowed. Preston had stopped near the vending machines. His voice low, measured, into the phone. "Yeah, he's alone. Black male, maybe 11 or 12, hood up, sitting by the windows, near gate B-23. Something feels off. I'd rather you checked it out before boarding." There it was. Something feels off. Shaq didn't move. He stood, posture calm, face unreadable. Every inch of him broadcasting control. Years of public life had taught him this stillness. But inside, his heart beat with a slow, heavy rhythm. He looked back at Devon, still sketching, unaware. The officer turned and began walking toward the boy. Shaq walked too. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't rush. But he arrived first, standing just behind his son, as the officer approached. "Excuse me, sir," the officer said, trying to project friendliness through authority. "This your son?" Devon looked up, confused. Shaq didn't look at the officer. He knelt down instead, placed a hand on Devon's shoulder. "Yeah," Shaq said, standing up to his full height. His voice was calm, heavy with something just beneath the surface. "He's mine. What's going on?" The officer hesitated. We got a report of someone acting suspicious near this gate. Just following protocol, sir. Shaq nodded slowly. He turned to Devon, who was now gathering his sketchbook, eyes darting between his father and the man in uniform. You scared, son? Shaq asked him gently. Devon shook his head, but his small shoulders had tensed. Shaq turned back. What exactly was suspicious? The sitting or the drawing? The officer looked uncomfortable. Just a report, sir. I don't make assumptions. Shaq nodded. But someone else did. Preston watched from a distance, arms crossed. A second officer had now appeared. A few passengers had started filming discreetly, phones held low, screens glowing. The gate agent stepped closer now. Is there a problem here? Shaq took a breath. Only the one created. He looked at Devon, who now stood beside him, sketchbook hugged to his chest. The boy's eyes were wet, but he wasn't crying, not yet. Shaq addressed the group calmly, voice firm. My son was sitting quietly, drawing airplanes. Someone thought that was enough to call security. No one responded. Preston finally stepped forward, voice tight. In today's world, we can't afford to overlook things that don't feel right. Shaq looked at him. You know what doesn't feel right? A black child sitting near an airport window, sketching a plane, being labeled a threat. Preston didn't respond. The second officer stepped back slightly, uncertain now. The first one cleared his throat. Sir, we apologize for the misunderstanding. You're free to board when the flight's ready. Shaq didn't say anything else. He took Devon's hand and led him back to the seats. The passengers were watching, murmuring, some with sympathy, some with discomfort, but no one said a word to Preston. Devon finally spoke, voice small. Did I do something wrong, Dad? Shaq squeezed his hand gently. No, son. But someone else did. Devon looked down, unsure. Why do they think I'm bad? Shaq sighed, long and quiet. They don't think, Devon. That's the problem. They sat again. The tension in the air remained, invisible but thick. Devon returned to his sketchbook slowly. Shaq didn't stop him. The boy needed to reclaim the space, turn it back into his. Preston returned to the gate counter. His jaw was clenched. His shift wasn't over. But something about his confidence had slipped. Shaq watched him from a distance. Not with anger, with intent. He wasn't going to let this slide. Not for Devon. Not for any boy who looked like him. Not again. He only wanted to draw planes, not become the reason police showed up. The windows overlooking the tarmac stretched like a wall of light, framing the parked aircraft and the distant bustle of ground crews, maneuvering in well-rehearsed patterns. Devon sat with his knees tucked under him, his sketchbook balanced across his lap. His pencil moved in clean, swift arcs, capturing the curve of a 737's nose cone, the detail in its engines, the shadows beneath its wings. This was his space, not the airport, not the polished floor beneath him, but the world inside the lines he created. His hoodie was up, not out of attitude, but habit. It helped him focus, drown out distractions, soften the world that often watched him too closely. He'd learned, even at 12, that being quiet didn't mean you'd go unnoticed. But today felt different. He had his father nearby, the safety of purpose in his drawings, and the excitement of flying to a new city. Nothing about his presence was unusual, except to people who were looking for something to fear. A couple passed by, middle-aged, well-dressed, wheeling compact carry-ons. The woman glanced at Devon, slowed slightly, then leaned into her partner and whispered something. He didn't respond, but the way his eyebrows twitched said enough. Devon didn't notice. His pencil moved to the tail fin now, sketching in the airline's logo. Precision was his favorite part. Behind the gate counter, Preston Mavell reappeared, tablet in hand, eyes scanning the gate area. His gaze paused on Devon, long enough to harden. He didn't recognize the boy from before, not really. He hadn't looked closely then, but something about that still figure, the bowed head, the hoodie, the distance from the parents, something triggered a reaction that wasn't based in reason. He walked to the edge of the counter and folded his arms. Two more people looked where he was looking. One of them, a man in a business suit, took out his phone and tapped the screen, possibly texting, possibly more. The energy near gate B23 shifted, the way animals sense an oncoming storm before the clouds even move. Shaq was watching from his seat. He hadn't said anything, hadn't moved, but the way he sat forward now, arms resting on his knees, eyes fixed on his son, told a different story. He knew, not what, not how far it would go. But he knew the ingredients. He could feel it beginning to boil. Devon flipped a page, began a new sketch. This time he focused on the landing gear, trying to get the proportions just right. A small shadow moved near him. Another passenger, looking out the window but pretending not to glance down at him. Devon offered a quiet smile out of instinct. The woman stepped away quickly. That puzzled him. He went back to drawing. Preston whispered something again to the gate agent. She nodded slightly, but didn't meet his eyes. It was a subtle nod, one of reluctant agreement. She was clearly uncomfortable, but not enough to challenge him. That's how it often started. Not with anger, not with loud accusations, but with small concessions, silent permissions given to prejudice under the mask of caution. The whisper spread, not in words, but in posture. More eyes began to follow Devon's movements, some curious, some guarded. A child alone near a jet bridge would normally elicit concern only if he were crying or lost. But Devon was doing neither. He was creating, and yet the unease deepened. Shaq stood. He walked over to a nearby vending machine, not far from where Devon sat. He took his time, pretended to browse the options. He knew not to approach too quickly. That would confirm someone's idea of urgency. Instead, he let the machine beep as he made his selection, the hum of the soda dropping into the tray filling the moment with harmless sound. He turned back slowly and looked down the terminal. His eyes locked on Preston. Just for a second. It wasn't a stare meant to challenge. It was a question. A simple, silent one. Why? But Preston looked away. Guilt wasn't visible, but neither was conviction. Devon took a sip from the soda. Shaq handed him. He still hadn't caught on fully, not to the storm brewing around him. He was only starting to sense it. The way people shifted as he passed. The way grown-ups began whispering when he moved. The way space suddenly seemed to close around him. I did a good one, Devon said, holding up the sketchbook. Shaq knelt beside him and took a look. The drawing was clean, thoughtful, detailed. That's art, son, he said softly, a hand resting briefly on Devon's shoulder. You keep going. Devon smiled, beaming in the way only a son who's earned his father's praise can beam. He turned back to the next page. Shaq returned to his seat. He could feel it now, the second wave. A woman with a child of her own pulled her daughter closer. A man, a few rows down, opened his briefcase, but kept glancing over the top of it. Security hadn't arrived yet, but the people were becoming alert. The ones who waited, who speculated, who became convinced of threat without a shred of evidence. And then Preston stepped away from the counter again. This time it wasn't subtle. He walked with a phone pressed to his ear, turning away so no one could hear him speak. But Shaq didn't need to. He already knew. He knew what was being said. He knew that somewhere behind those words was the phrase, just in case. It was always framed like that. Shaq stood again. This time he didn't pretend to go for snacks. He walked over to Devon and sat beside him on the floor. Devon looked up in surprise. Something wrong? He asked. Nope, Shaq said, eyes still watching the crowd. Just figured we draw together this time. Devon grinned and handed him a pencil. You sure? You always say you can't even draw a stick, man. Time to learn, Shaq said. They sat together in that bright hallway of glass, and waiting, father and son, side by side, sketching quietly as the crowd around them continued to whisper without words. But it wasn't just about Devon anymore. Not now. Shaq knew this moment had a spotlight, even if the stage wasn't visible yet. He knew there were eyes on them, and he knew what those eyes expected. He refused to give it to them. The pilot had finished his call. He returned to the counter, but this time, the gate agent whispered something back. Her tone was different now, more hesitant. Something about the way Shaq sat next to his son had shifted the narrative. Not for everyone, but for still, the damage had already begun to echo. One person's paranoia had planted a seed. One phone call had started a chain of events that, even if paused, couldn't be undone. Devon finished another drawing. He showed it to Shaq. Better than the last one, Shaq said. You think I can really be an airplane designer? Devon asked, eyes serious now. Shaq looked at his son, not at the sketch, not at the people watching, not at the hidden biases all around them, but at the boy. The way his spirit remained unbent, even now. I don't think it, Shaq said. I know it. Just then, an airport staff member approached the gate counter, whispering something urgent to Preston. Preston's jaw clenched. He didn't nod, he didn't argue, but he stepped away. The sketchbook pages flipped in the breeze of an arriving flight. The boarding call came overhead. Shaq stood with Devon, collected their things, and walked calmly back to the line forming for their flight. The whispers didn't stop, but they didn't follow either. Shaq didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The stares had already said enough. It wasn't fear. It was something colder than that. Preston Mavell moved with purpose, though he masked it in calm. His steps were quiet, rehearsed like a man accustomed to being in command. With his tablet tucked under one arm, he walked past the terminal coffee shop, stopping near a row of wall-mounted phones used mostly by airport staff. He pulled out his personal phone instead, checking the surroundings twice, then dialing a number from memory. It wasn't a 911 call. It was a direct line to airport operations. His voice was steady, not frantic. "This is Captain Preston Mavell. I'm reporting a suspicious individual at gate B23. Minor. Black male. Appears to be alone. Hoodie on. Sitting close to the jetway windows. I can't confirm intent, but something feels off. Might be worth having someone take a look, just in case." The words fell into the receiver without hesitation. They were crafted with practiced ambiguity, just enough to spark action, not enough to invite blame. It wasn't a cry of danger. It was a seed, and the ground it landed in was dry and flammable. Back at the gate, a low chime hummed overhead, a subtle code embedded into the usual airport ambiance. Few passengers noticed, but Shaq did. Years of moving through crowded, secure spaces had attuned him to the smallest shifts. He looked up, eyes narrowing as he caught sight of Preston returning to the counter. Something in the man's body language had changed. Not tension, not nerves, something cooler. The look of someone who had just done what they thought was necessary and was waiting for confirmation that it worked. Shaq rose from his seat, casually masking his alertness with an easy stretch of his shoulders. Devon was still near the window, drawing, unaware. At peace. Shaq's eyes moved, scanning for uniforms. One, then two. TSA agents walking without urgency, but with direction, toward his son. He stepped forward. Quiet, calm. Every fiber in his being pulsing to react, to step between Devon and whatever assumptions were about to unfold. But he held himself back. For now. He needed to see how far this would go. Who would say what? Who would play which part? The agents arrived, not with aggression but with procedure. One of them, a woman with short blonde hair and sharp eyes, approached Devon. The other stood slightly back, observing. "Hey there, buddy," she said gently, crouching to Devon's level. "Can I ask what you're doing?" Devon looked up, startled. "I'm just drawing planes." She nodded slowly, glancing at the sketchbook, then back at her partner. "You here by yourself?" Devon hesitated. "No, my dad's right over there." She followed his point. Saw Shaq. Recognition flashed across her face. Shaq approached, calm but direct. "Is there a problem here?" The officer stood up, adjusting her tone quickly. "No problem, sir. Just got a report of an unaccompanied minor sitting near the gate." Shaq looked directly into her eyes. "He's not unaccompanied. He's with me. And he's not doing anything wrong." The second officer stepped in, offering a half apology. "Probably just a misunderstanding. Happens more than you'd think. People report what they think they see." Shaq's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. And what exactly did someone think they saw? A kid sitting quietly with a pencil? There was no answer. Just an uncomfortable pause. The kind that says everything no one is willing to admit. "May I ask," Shaq said, still keeping his posture controlled, "who made the call?" The officers glanced at each other, then vaguely in Preston's direction. It was passed along by a staff member. "We don't always get names." Shaq followed their look. Preston was standing at the counter again, speaking to the gate agent, eyes carefully avoiding the scene. Shaq didn't move toward him. Not yet. But now he knew. Devon stood beside his father, confused, his sketchbook hugged tight against his chest. "Dad, did I do something wrong?" "No," Shaq said softly, putting an arm around his shoulders. "You did everything right." The officers, sensing the heat of scrutiny, stepped away, not dismissed, not defeated, but diffused. They had nothing to hold, no cause to act, but the damage had been done, not to Devon's record, but to his trust. Shaq guided his son back to their seats. A few passengers nearby were now watching with quiet curiosity. Some had overheard, some hadn't. But they could feel the energy shifting. A child confronted. A father intervening. A moment most of them would forget. But that would stay in Devon's chest like a stone. Shaq glanced at Preston once more. Still no eye contact. Still no acknowledgement. It wasn't fear that drove Preston's actions. It was something colder. Calculated. Prejudice wrapped in protocol. A judgment made in silence and passed on in whispers. Shaq knew that look. He'd seen it before in boardrooms, in lobbies, in classrooms during his youth. It was the look of someone who believed themselves objective while being anything but. He took out his phone and made a note. Not a video. Not a confrontation. Just a name. A time. A detail. He'd deal with it later. There were ways to uncover what lay beneath polished uniforms and professional tones. Devon leaned against him. Quiet now. Not frightened. Just thoughtful. The innocence of the morning had shifted, and Shaq could feel it in the way the boy leaned. A little closer. They waited in silence for the boarding call. But neither of them was the same as before. Something had changed. The sketchbook was still in Devon's hand, but the world around it had darkened just a little. And Shaq was already thinking 3 moves ahead. He wasn't even old enough to fly alone, but old enough to be profiled. Devon had just begun shading the underside of the jet wing when the second wave of uniforms arrived. Not TSA this time, but airport security. Navy blue jackets, utility belts and radios buzzing with clipped static. They didn't rush. That would have drawn attention. Instead, they moved with an ease that said, "We do this all the time." Shaq caught sight of them from across the terminal. His heart kicked once. Not from fear, but from recognition. This wasn't an accident anymore. Something was being orchestrated. His eyes flicked to Preston, who now stood off to the side of the counter, arms crossed, lips tight. He wasn't just watching. He was waiting. The lead officer, a square-jawed man with a buzz cut and a name tag that read Forrester, approached Devon, who had set his pencil down, sensing something wasn't right. Another officer, a younger woman with auburn hair, flanked him, clipboard in hand. "Hey there, son," Forrester said with practiced friendliness. "Can we speak with you for a second?" Devon's eyes darted to his father across the way. "Why? You here alone?" Forrester asked. Devon shook his head. "No, my dad's right there." He pointed just as Shaq stepped forward. His walk was deliberate, unhurried, but heavy with presence. Passengers seated nearby began whispering again. The energy shifted palpably. People could feel that something bigger was unfolding. Shaq arrived, standing between the officers and his son. "He's with me," he said simply. Forrester sized him up, the way people did when trying to mask discomfort with professional neutrality. "Sir, we had a report. We're just responding to a concern." "What kind of concern?" Shaq asked, voice cool. "Unattended minor acting suspiciously near a restricted area," the female officer added, not looking directly at Devon. Shaq looked down at his son. "You trying to hijack that 727 with a number 2 pencil, Devon?" Devon managed a nervous smile. "Just drawing." "Sir," Forrester said, clearly not amused. "We need to follow through. May I see his ID?" "He's 12, Shaq said. "He doesn't carry ID." Forrester glanced back at his partner, who seemed suddenly unsure of the procedure. Shaq stepped forward, subtly positioning himself between them and his son. "What exactly is suspicious?" he asked again, more forcefully this time. The female officer gestured at the sketchbook. There were concerns that he might have been observing the aircraft layouts too closely. Security diagrams, gate layouts. It raised a flag. Shaq stared at her, the disbelief simmering just beneath his expression. "You mean he's drawing planes? Because he loves them? Because he wants to build them one day? And because he's black, that's a red flag?" "No one's saying that," Forrester replied. "But that's exactly what's happening," Shaq snapped. "My son is a child, sitting, drawing, and you treat him like a threat, because someone said the magic word suspicious." By now more eyes had turned. Phones were being subtly raised, screens glowing. The invisible audience had arrived. Shaq noticed. He always noticed. "Can I ask who reported him?" he added. Forrester hesitated, then nodded toward the gate. It came from staff, pilot concern. Shaq turned his head slowly, deliberately, and locked eyes with Preston. This time, Preston didn't look away, but he didn't walk over either. "He's profiling," Shaq said clearly, loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "And you're enforcing it." Forrester's voice dropped. "Sir, I understand this is upsetting." "No, You don't. Shaq interrupted, still calm but colder now. Because if you did, you wouldn't be talking to him like he's a suspect. He's a boy. 12. You've got 2 officers standing over him like he's a flight risk, and the only thing you've got on him is graphite on paper. The female officer seemed to shrink slightly. Her clipboard lowered. Shaq looked at Devon, who now stood with his sketchbook clutched to his chest, face pale. This wasn't confusion anymore. This was fear settling in. A lesson being learned in real time. A lesson his father had hoped to delay for a few more years. Forrester cleared his throat. Let's take a breath here. No one's accusing. You are. Shaq cut in. From the moment you walked up to him. You want to make this go away? Start with an apology. Then you can answer why you're allowing staff to escalate harmless behavior into racial panic. Behind them, Preston finally spoke, stepping forward. With all due respect, he said, voice clipped. I made the call because something didn't feel right. It's my job to look out for risks. We're trained to respond to intuition as well as evidence. Shaq turned fully to face him now, taking a slow breath. You're trained to profile, Preston, he said. You saw a black kid alone in a hoodie near a plane, and that was enough. You didn't talk to him. You didn't ask questions. You called in a report. You started this. Preston crossed his arms. You think I wanted this to blow up? I think you wanted to be safe from a boy who was never a threat. And now that it's public, you want it to disappear quietly. Let's not turn this into a scene, Preston muttered, glancing at the crowd. It became a scene the moment you picked up the phone, Shaq said. One of the passengers stepped forward. A middle-aged woman in a navy coat. I saw it, she said. The kid was just sitting there, sketching. He wasn't bothering anyone. Another voice behind her added. It didn't look suspicious to me either. Looked like a kid with talent. The ripple grew. People weren't shouting. They were observing, watching, waiting for what would happen next. There was tension in the air, sharp and loaded, but no one moved aggressively. It wasn't that kind of story. It was the slower kind. The kind that burrowed into memory. Forrester finally stepped back. Sir, Mr. O'Neill, I think we can resolve this. Let's de-escalate. Too late for that, Shaq said. You made my son feel like a criminal. You made me relive something I've seen too many times. Now we finish this the right way. He looked around. Anyone here know the regional manager for Delta? Someone raised a hand, almost sheepishly. My sister works at HQ. Want her contact. Shaq took the name, saved it. Thanks. Then to Preston. You messed up. And if you think a badge and a uniform make you immune from accountability, you've mistaken the time we're living in. Preston said nothing. Shaq turned back to Devon, kneeling down. You okay? He asked softly. Devon nodded. Barely. You want to keep drawing? Devon looked at his sketchbook, hesitant, then opened it again. Yeah. Shaq stood, faced the officers one last time. You ever want to know what a threat really looks like? He said. It's a grown man calling the police on a child who was just being himself. No one stopped them as they walked back to their seats. The crowd parted, and the silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was reflective. Blue uniforms returned to their posts. But their faces stayed red. Someone was filming. Always is. The confrontation had barely cooled before the evidence began to breathe on its own. From 2 rows back near gate B23, a woman in a burgundy trench coat with silver curls framing her face had already posted a 30-second video to her feed. No caption, just footage. Devon standing stiffly clutching his sketchbook. 2 officers hovering. Shaq stepping in with calm, steel-wrapped authority. Preston framed just beyond the counter, standing in the backdrop with folded arms and a fixed expression. The sound was low but clear. The words didn't need enhancement. They spoke in tone as much as content. And by the time boarding was announced, that clip had found its wings. Somewhere on the concourse, a ping from a teen's phone echoed the beginning of a chain reaction. Within 30 minutes, the video appeared on a trending account dedicated to documenting airport incidents. 45 minutes later, a journalist from a mid-size Atlanta paper reposted it with the headline, Shaquille O'Neal confronts airport security over son's profiling incident. Shaq hadn't planned on making noise. He didn't move through the world to collect viral moments or manufacture outrage. But the clip wasn't about performance. It was about presence. It was about how quickly a child's innocence could be disrupted by assumption. About how people in uniform could lean on policy to justify profiling. And how intuition had become a shield for racial discomfort. On the plane, Devon sat by the window, the sketchbook now closed, but in his lap. He was quiet, thoughtful, not shaken, exactly, but altered. The look in his eyes said he had stepped into something new and didn't quite know how to step back out. Shaq sat beside him, phone buzzing with texts from people he hadn't spoken to in months, some checking in, some asking if they could share the clip, some trying to book him for interviews. The noise had started to swirl, and with it came a pressure he'd long known. When you're famous and black, your personal moments become public property, the moment conflict touches them. He turned the phone over, ignored the buzzes, looked at his son. "You all right?" he asked quietly. Devin nodded, then paused. "Why do people look at me like I did something wrong?" Shaq sighed. "Because some people can't tell the difference between fear and bias. So they mix them up, and we get caught in the middle." Devin leaned his head against the window. "They didn't even ask me anything at first." "I know." A silence fell between them, not empty, but heavy. When they landed in D.C., the clip had crossed the million-view mark. News segments had picked it up. The angle was tight, the audio clean, the context clear. There were no raised voices, no resistance, just a father intervening, a boy standing quiet, and a security response that was impossible to defend when seen in full. By evening, Sketchbook Not Suspicious began trending. Preston's name hadn't surfaced yet, but internally the airline's corporate PR team was already preparing a statement. Damage control had begun. In hushed meetings, phrases like internal review, training gaps, and response misjudgment were being tossed around like empty promises. But Shaq hadn't said a word to the press, not yet, and that silence more than anything was making people nervous. They knew his platform. They knew his reach, but they didn't know his plan. The next morning, Shaq met privately with his legal advisor and longtime friend, Roman Carlyle, in a small conference room at the event venue. Roman was already flipping through reports, printouts of social media responses, even a partial transcript someone had generated from the clip. "Look," Roman said, laying down the packet. "You've got leverage. This isn't just a media moment. This could force a systemic reevaluation of how airline staff profile young black travelers, especially boys." I mean, Devin didn't say a word, and they had two officers standing over him. Shaq leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "I'm not interested in headlines. I want them to look inward. Actually see what this was." Roman nodded. "Then we make that the ask. No press conference. No outrage campaign. We set up a meeting with airline executives and demand accountability. Not for optics, actual structural changes. Training, review boards, written policy adjustments." Shaq agreed. "And I want Preston there." Roman raised an eyebrow. "That might take some negotiation." "Then negotiate." Meanwhile, back at the airport, Preston's day wasn't going as smoothly. He'd arrived for his next scheduled flight only to be pulled aside by his supervisor. The conversation was civil but clear. Until further notice, he was grounded pending a review. His discomfort from the day before had hardened into quiet resentment. He didn't think he'd done anything wrong. He hadn't yelled, hadn't overstepped, hadn't touched the boy. But the video didn't care about what didn't happen. It showed what did, and public opinion had already decided. He had seen a black child, and without evidence or conversation, he had decided he was a threat. Now he was the one being watched. Across the internet, comments stacked high beneath every reposted clip. "That kid looked terrified. This is what racial profiling looks like." Imagine being 12 and treated like a criminal for drawing. Shaq handled that like a king. Calm, strong, no yelling. That's how you do it. The officer trying to downplay it after knowing it was his son. Shameful. It wasn't the first time this had happened to a child, to a parent, to a black family just trying to exist peacefully in a shared space. But the difference this time was reach. This time, the man beside the boy wasn't just any father. He was Big Shaq, and that meant the world had to pay attention. By midday, major media outlets were calling his foundation. His assistant fielded CNN, the New York Times, even a morning talk show. But Shaq declined them all. He didn't want to speak to cameras. Not yet. He wanted action, not applause. That evening, a brief official statement was issued from the airline. It read, "We are aware of the incident involving Mr. O'Neill and his son at one of our departure gates, and are conducting a full review. We are committed to ensuring all passengers are treated with respect and dignity, and are reassessing internal policies and procedures. We appreciate the patience of those affected." It was neat, vague, non-committal. But it opened the door. Shaq responded with a single post on his foundation's social media page. Sketching isn't suspicious. Being black shouldn't make it so. We've begun the conversation. Now we're waiting for real answers. The post received over 800,000 likes within the first 6 hours. Devin, reading it over his dad's shoulder, asked softly, "Did I do something important?" Shaq smiled gently. "You didn't have to do anything important, son. You are important. That's the difference." He wore a uniform that promised safety, but hid an old stain beneath it. It started with a hunch, the kind that didn't shake off with sleep or logic. Shaq had seen Preston's eyes that day. Not afraid, not defensive, just firm. Firm in the way only certainty speaks, and certainty without evidence, especially when it targets someone like Devon, usually hides a deeper history. Shaq didn't storm into action. That wasn't his way. He moved like he always had in the post-game world. Calculated, quiet, connected. There were people he trusted. People who didn't need to ask why he wanted information. Only how deep he wanted it. One of them was Marla Kersey, a private investigator based out of Chicago. A former federal analyst, sharp and discreet. When Shaq called, she didn't hesitate. "Do you want a basic sweep or a full lens?" she asked. "Everything," Shaq replied. "Pilots don't just profile out of nowhere. I want patterns. Any history with complaints, any departmental notes, even whispers." She had something within the day. Preston Mavell, 38, divorced, no children, born in Vermont, served briefly in the Air National Guard before moving to civilian aviation. Clean record on paper, but aviation doesn't always document whispers, and sometimes it hides them. Marla's voice on the second call was lower. "There's something," she said. 3 years ago in Dallas. He was first officer on a flight where a black passenger was removed after a seat reassignment error. No written report, but a crew member flagged it quietly. Said Preston had requested the passenger be removed without real cause. They said the guy looked jumpy. No follow-up. No escalation. Shaq sat in silence, processing. "That's not all," Marla continued. 2 months ago, an internal memo flagged a gate complaint. Preston filed. He said a young man was lingering too long near the jetway. Turns out it was a teenager waiting for his aunt. No apology issued. The family dropped it. Shaq exhaled slowly. A pattern. A profile. Not overt. But I practiced. "Send me everything you've got," he said. He pulled up Preston's photo again. The press had still not mentioned his name. Corporate silence was protecting him. But Shaq knew it wouldn't hold. Not once the truth widened. He reached out to his own network next. People in aviation, sports, law, quiet conversations. One contact at the FAA mentioned a previous captain who had refused to fly with Preston more than once. Not formally stated, but privately known. Said he had issues reading people wrong, and tension around youth passengers of color. Shaq didn't feel surprise. He felt validation. And that changed everything. He wasn't going to let this slide into the fog of unconfirmed suspicion. Not when Devon's name had almost become a footnote in someone else's paranoia. At home, Shaq sat with his son that evening. After dinner, Devon was back at his desk, drawing again. More planes. But now he added people. A father, tall and calm. A boy shaded with careful strokes. A uniformed figure in the distance. The drawing didn't need a caption. It was the caption. "You ever feel like people expect you to mess up just because of how you look?" Shaq asked. Devon paused, pencil hovering. "Sometimes." "What do you do when that happens?" "I try to prove them wrong." Shaq nodded. "Good. But proving them wrong isn't always enough. Sometimes you have to expose why they think that way in the first place." Devon looked up. "Is that what you're doing?" Shaq smiled. Small and proud. "Yes, son. That's what I'm doing." The next morning, Marla sent him a sealed folder. It wasn't just notes anymore. It was evidence. Internal emails. Crew statements. Even a private training report where Preston had questioned the loyalty of a flight attendant who spoke Spanish to passengers. Shaq read every word. This wasn't a mistake. Preston had a mindset. One cloaked in uniform and regulation, but rotting underneath. And now Shaq knows it. Knew it the way a father knows when his child has been wronged. Not by chance, but by choice. The uniform Preston wore said, pilot. But the man behind it had been quietly navigating a flight path of bias for years, and it was time someone grounded him. For real, America doesn't just love Big Shaq. It listens when he speaks. The press conference wasn't planned by agents or PR teams. There were no glossy backdrops, no corporate sponsors, no teleprompters. It was held in a modest hall at the Youth Education Summit, flanked by folding chairs and two standing banners bearing the name of Shaq's foundation. The media had already been circling for days, eager to turn Devon's ordeal into a headline. But Shaq had waited. He didn't want a soundbite. He wanted a statement that couldn't be edited down to a viral reel. At 10 a.m., the room filled. Local journalists, national outlets, and a few independent creators sat shoulder to shoulder. Their cameras were trained on the podium. The air held a strange kind of anticipation, part reverence, part unease. Everyone knew this wasn't going to be about sports. Shaq walked in with Devon by his side. The boy was quiet, composed, in a navy button-up and jeans. He looked every bit the child he was, yet older now, aged by scrutiny he never asked for. Shaq wore black, not for drama, for clarity. When he reached the podium, he didn't unfold a script. He didn't clear his throat. He looked into the crowd and spoke the way he always had. Low, slow, real. I've spent most of my life in front of cameras. They've captured the best and worst of me. But what they caught this time wasn't about me. It was about a boy who wanted to draw airplanes. My son. He paused. Devon sat in the front row, back straight, sketchbook in hand. Not drawing, just holding it. What happened at that gate wasn't an accident, Shaq continued. It was a pattern, a reflex, the kind that follows black kids into stores, classrooms, airports. People saw a hoodie and a shade of skin and thought that made my son a threat. No crime, no raised voice, just a pencil, just presence. The room was silent, except for the shutters clicking. I've been called a lot of things in my life, he said. Athlete, entertainer, philanthropist. But the most important thing I'll ever be is a father. And what I felt that day wasn't just anger, it was fear. The fear every black parent carries, that no matter how successful you are, how kind or smart your child is, they will still be reduced to a profile the second someone feels uncomfortable. He let the weight of that hang. Shaq turned a page from the manila folder, on the podium. I looked into the man who reported my son, Captain Preston Manville. On paper, clean. But if you dig deeper, there's a pattern. Prior incidents, informal complaints, subtle removals, all with one thing in common: color. Young black male, like my son. Gasps rippled quietly in the room. This isn't about ruining a man's career, Shaq added. It's about stopping a quiet violence. The kind that doesn't leave bruises, but leaves scars. That tells black kids they're dangerous by default. That punishes their presence before it ever sees their personhood. He stepped back from the mic, hands braced against the podium edge. I'm calling for 3 things, he said, voice firmer now. 1. A federal investigation into racial profiling practices in domestic aviation. 2. A third-party review board for passenger complaints involving race. And 3. Required racial bias training for every airport staff member and flight crew in this country. Not the surface-level stuff. The real kind. The kind that makes people uncomfortable and aware. He looked at Devon again. The boy gave him a tiny nod. A father's fuel. Shaq ended simply, my son deserves better. All our sons do. The applause wasn't explosive. It was heavy, purposeful. The sound of people who knew they'd heard truth and couldn't unhear it. Within hours, the airline responded with a new statement. One that confirmed Preston had been placed on temporary suspension, pending full review. The language was corporate, the tone cautious, but the action was real. They were feeling the heat now, because this wasn't just a clip, this was a movement in motion. Shaq's words aired on every network by evening. News anchors quoted him, editorialists praised his composure, and parents across the country, black and not, shared stories of their own. Moments when their children had been made to feel like suspects before being seen as human. And somewhere behind all the broadcasts, in a quiet apartment near the airport, Preston watched the press conference alone. He didn't call anyone, didn't issue a personal statement. He sat in the dark, laptop glowing, face tight. He wasn't afraid. Not yet. But for the first time in his career, his reputation was no longer hidden behind a cockpit door. It was in the open, and Shaq had made sure of that. Someone else didn't like Big Shaq speaking up, and they made it known. Shaq had expected resistance. He had faced it before, but this was different. It began the morning after the press conference. He woke to a knock on his hotel door. Opening it, he found an envelope slipped beneath. No return address. Inside, a single folded piece of paper. Stop digging, or you'll lose more than your reputation. No signature, just threat. It hit harder than he'd anticipated. Devon, still half asleep, peered around the door. Shaq folded the note back into its envelope and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Probably junk mail, he said, voice steady. But the weight in his gut had shifted. That day, his assistant reported 2 more incidents. An anonymous email sent to Devon's school, raising concern about the delicate safety of the student body. Another racist explicit poured into the inbox of Shaq's foundation. A firewall had caught it, but not before enough words had escaped to draw notice. Pulse-quickening emails talking about big Negro families and stick-to-sports illusions. Shaq stared at the screen, breath sharp. He called Devon's school principal, making it clear Devon was not to be treated as a spectacle. He'd arranged for additional guidance counselor support. The school was aligned, sympathetic, and apologetic, but it left him with an uneasy truth. Someone was watching from the shadows, and they were emboldened enough to strike at his son's education. That afternoon, as he and Devon walked to their hotel car, a black SUV pulled up too close. As they exited, windows dark, engine idling, Shaq felt the hair at his nape stiffen. He picked up Devon's hand and moved across the street, never breaking stride. They waved off the driver, but the message remained unspoken. We're still here. At night, Shaq sat in a dim hotel room, lit only by his laptop. He began tracing the email headers, contacting cybersecurity contacts. He didn't respond, not directly, but routed the threats to legal. He requested surveillance footage from school entrances. He noted every sign, every signifier, and beneath each, he placed purpose. This was no coincidence, no random act from an online troll. It felt coordinated. He spoke with Roman again, their voice calls now happening in whispered tones and locked channel lines. They're testing us, Shaq said, frowning. They want to see if this fades when the cameras stop rolling. It won't, Roman replied. You have the platform, the legitimacy, the momentum. Don't flinch now. Momentum. That's what Shaq had feared losing. Not the headline, but the work, institutional change. There were real goals ahead. Policy reforms, federal hearings, airline committee meetings. A viral moment was only useful if it carried momentum. Distraction was the danger. In the lobby the next morning, Devon greeted him with a quiet drawing. His best yet. The boy had captured them walking away from the SUV, the looming silhouette behind them, half-formed. It was ominous. Yet Devon had included a sun overhead, a symbol of light against the shadow. Shaq lifted the drawing, emotions mixing with pride. You see that? That's protection. And hope. Devon nodded. It felt weird, but you made me safe. His small hand on the paper reminded Shaq why this mattered. Not fame, not justice abstract, but his son's peace. He walked past the hotel bar, laptop bag slung over his shoulder. A man approached in a crisp suit, badge clipped at his waist. Mr. O'Neill, he said, voice polite but impersonal. I'm Detective Reyes with Airport PD. We're looking into the threats you've received. They talked for a while. Reyes assured Shaq of increased security and offered a review of surveillance logs. We take these seriously, especially involving children. Shaq nodded. I appreciate that. He glanced out the window toward the road. Because he's just a kid. He let the whole sentence land. That night, Shaq hosted a small meeting at his hotel suite with Roman, Marla, Detective Reyes, and the school principal dialing in. Every angle mapped, every board, a plan in motion, cybersecurity monitoring, school surveillance presence, and a private attorney filing preliminary notices. They all understood. Raising a public voice meant inviting targeted retaliation. But now, they would outpace it. Across the country, social media had not been forgotten. The push for the review board gained traction. A federal congressman publicly backed Shaq, and protesters began showing outside major airports, carrying signs reading "Sketches not suspicion" and "Protect Black Boys Everywhere." Shaq watched the images flow in with Devon curled next to him on the bed. The boy's face was solemn. He wasn't naive enough to smile at the spectacle, but there was steel in him now. Confidence tempered by wisdom. Shaq knew that tougher tests lay ahead. A system as vast as aviation had checks, balances, and blind spots. Someone didn't like that he'd spoken up, but he was already several steps ahead. He leaned over, Hugged Devon close. We're building skyscrapers, son. One stone at a time. Devon nestled in. Let's keep building. Because the anonymous voices in the dark weren't the end. They were the echo of what needed to change. And Big Shaq, with a steady voice and sharper resolve, wasn't about to let silence win. One voice stepped out of the shadows and changed the entire story. Shaq had prepared for conversations with airline executives, for interviews with lawmakers, and even for another round of press questions. But he hadn't prepared for a stranger's voice on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, interrupting his carefully scheduled day. The call came through his foundation's line, soft, firm, and unmistakable. "This is Harper Lane," a woman said, her voice steady yet edged with apprehension. "I was a flight attendant. I used to fly with Preston." Shaq sat in his office, the afternoon light filtering through half-open blinds. He nodded, even though Harper couldn't see him. "Go on." She paused, gathering strength. "I witnessed something similar about a year ago. A black teenager. Let's call him Marcus. Preston flagged him after he was sketching his notebook during a layover. Crew wanted to talk with him. They did. Quietly. And it ended with the boy being escorted off the flight. No official report. No follow-up. Just the passenger had to leave." Shaq leaned forward. He switched voice from phone to recording on the Foundation app. He could tell Harper was weighing whether to continue. When the crew tried to report it, the flight manager said the airline didn't want another headline. Harper continued. "So it got buried. But I remember the boy's face. Terrified. And Preston's final words in my memory. They were calm. Too calm. He said, 'I'm just making sure we're safe.' It sounded rehearsed. A promise of safety masking a pattern Shaq now understood more clearly. They arranged a secure meeting for the next morning at a neutral location, a public cafe in Atlanta. Shaq arrived early, dressed casually, but his presence filled the room like a storm. Harper stepped in, tray in hand, nervous but composed. She had work-worn hands and eyes that seemed to carry stories. They sat with coffee between them. After introductions and brief small talk, Harper exhaled. "It was spring," she began. "We were on a flight from Detroit to Chicago. A bright morning, like today. The boy, maybe 13, was drawing quietly. No one paid him any mind until Preston came through. Badge clipped to his belt, looked right at him and said he wanted to see what he was doing." Harper paused, voice steady but heavy. He looked at that sketchbook and frowned. Not fear, disapproval. Said it was inappropriate detail. He asked the crew to handle it discreetly. They did walked him off mid-boarding. Never asked if he was unaccompanied. Never asked his name, just escorted him down the jetway. Shaq didn't speak for a moment, letting the cruel symmetry sink in. Another boy, another sketchbook, another removal. Same instrument, Preston's badge, applied in a way that matched Devon's ordeal. Only no video this time. No foundation to stand behind him. Harper looked at Shaq. "I'm telling you this now because I saw the news. I saw how you handled Devon, and I felt something break in me. I can't stay silent anymore." Shaq reached across the table and placed a reassuring hand on hers. "Thank you for coming forward." They spent the next hour going through details. Harper had dates, flight numbers, some internal logs she'd uncovered. She'd reached out to a pilot friend who'd confirmed there was at least one informal crew complaint filed afterward. No one acted on it, like it had never happened. Shaq knew this testimony changed everything. Not just for Devon, but for the other boy, and the system that had swept him away. A single voice stepping forward could create a choir. Harper's courage also strengthened public support. Shaq carefully structured the next move. She'd appear as a witness in a private briefing, with the airline's board of review, and possibly testify later in a public hearing. He would release a joint statement, one that focused on patterns, not punishment, and demand transparency. By afternoon, the airline's legal team reached out to schedule the internal review meeting. They were moving faster now. Preston's suspension was no longer a courtesy. It had become a necessity. Investors were watching. The optics were shifting. Meanwhile, social media erupted again. Harper's identity was still confidential, but threads discussing another boy taken off flight for sketching began trending. News accounts picked up the theme. Was Preston profiling a quiet artistic youth whenever he spotted a hoodie and a sketchpad? Support poured in for Devon, for the unnamed boy, and for the many others who might not have a public voice. Shaq, in the glow of the office light that evening, reviewed Harper's materials and drafted notes for his next meeting with the airline. He sat back and looked at Devon's latest drawing, A simple sketch of father and son walking through an airport, fists clenched not in aggression but in purpose. It reminded him why he couldn't stop now. He texted Harper, "See you tomorrow. We'll do this together." Her reply came swiftly, "Thank you. For everything." The next morning, inside a glass-walled boardroom at the airline's headquarters, Shaq, Roman, and Harper faced executives and legal counsel. The tension was quiet, but palpable. Reports were distributed, emails, flight logs, crew statements, Harper's account. Shaq let Harper speak first. She recounted the Detroit flight calmly, directly, refused to be rattled. When she finished, Shaq stood and spoke with authority grounded in personal stake and moral clarity. "To your credit," he began, "this isn't about destroying reputations. It's about ensuring this doesn't happen again. This is about protecting children, about recognizing how unchecked bias in the sky can bring a child's world down." He laid out evidence, timelines and the pattern, Devon's incident, Harper's testimony, Marla's findings, Preston's internal complaints. Then he outlined his requests, same 3 federal oversight, third-party review board, comprehensive bias training, and he added a 4th retroactive outreach to those affected, like Harper's passenger, to acknowledge harm done, and to offer meaningful apology or corrective settlement. Some executives looked uncomfortable. Legal counsel opened laptops. Preston sat off to the side, pale support staff at his side, watching in silence. When Shaq finished, a hush fell, then applause. Soft, careful, but genuine. The airline CEO cleared his throat. "We take this seriously," he said. "We will comply with your requests. And we sincerely apologize to Mr. O'Neill, the young man you represent, and any other travelers who suffered due to assumptions we failed to question." Harper exhaled in relief beside Shaq. He placed his hand on hers, meeting her eyes briefly. The moment was electric, not because of confrontation, but because of resolution and motion. Shaq turned to Preston, who had not spoken. "Captain Mavell," he said quietly but firmly, leaning forward, "I'm not here for retaliation. I'm here for Preston nodded, voice low. "I understand." The atmosphere shifted. It was transactional. Not victory, not forgiveness, but outside the building, cameras flashed. Shaq and Harper walked past them, voices murmuring to each other. Reporters asked questions. They answered simply, no, Preston wouldn't speak today. Yes, the focus now was systemic change. Devon, waiting outside with Roman, saw his father pass by Harper and put himself between them as they approached. Shaq bent and told his son what had happened. Devon's eyes widened, pride and wonder mixing in his gaze. "You were brave," Shaq said quietly. Devon squared his shoulders. "Like you." Together they left the airport, stepping into the sun that seemed to hold a promise. Not a neat ending, but a shift. One voice had stepped out of the shadows and changed the story. Here's the script for the 10th section. Sometimes justice looks like a revoked badge and a silent terminal. The conference room inside the airline's central administrative wing wasn't large, but it had the weight of finality. A long polished oak table stretched beneath recessed lighting, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the tarmac where planes continued their silent choreography. Inside, however, everything felt still, like turbulence waiting to break. The internal review hearing was closed to the public, but Shaq was there, seated at the center of the table with Roman and Harper to his right. Across from them, airline counsel and senior HR leadership. Preston sat farther down, flanked by a union rep and a legal advisor of his own. His eyes flicked to Shaq once, as the proceedings began, then quickly looked away. The review chair, a former federal judge now consulting on corporate accountability, began the session with a firm tone. "We are here not to deliberate intent, but to determine responsibility and appropriateness of conduct by Captain Preston Mavell during and prior to the March 14th incident involving minor Devon O'Neill." No one responded. The silence gave way to document shuffling, statements being entered into record. Harper was the first to testify, her voice unwavering. She spoke clearly about the Detroit incident, the black teenager removed without cause, the suspicious glance, the refusal to log the report in the flight's final report. She offered dates, crew comments, even her personal notes. Then came the digital review emails, recovered from internal archives, not illegal, but damning in implication. Preston's language was never overtly racist, but phrases like unaccompanied urban male, loitering behavior, and potential gang signals in sketches appeared more than once. Each one chipped away at the argument of coincidence. Each one painted a clearer picture. Shaq did not speak until the final hour. When called upon, he stood, tall and still. His voice when it came was calm but anchored in a gravity that silenced the room. "I'm not here as a celebrity. I'm here as a father. A black father who watched his son get labeled a threat for doing what kids are supposed to do. Be curious, be creative, be free." What Preston did wasn't an isolated moment. It was a continuation of unchecked authority fed by bias. He paused, looked directly at Preston. "It could have ended differently. If I wasn't famous. If people hadn't recorded. If my son had looked just a little more afraid. Who knows what the report would have said then." There was no dramatic outburst. No shouting. Just the slow recognition that truth doesn't need to scream to be undeniable. After a recess, the panel returned with its decision. Captain Preston Mavell's behavior was found inconsistent with the professional standards and ethical expectations of this airline. While not rising to the level of criminal negligence, the pattern of discriminatory profiling constitutes a breach of trust incompatible with continued service. Effective immediately, his flight status is revoked, and his commercial pilot's license will be referred to the FAA for full review. Preston sat motionless. His lawyer whispered something, but he didn't respond. There was no shock, just the final weight of consequences pressing down. Shaq offered no smirk, no satisfaction. He stood, nodded at Harper, and shook the hand of the review chair before exiting the room. Outside the terminal, the usual airport chaos moved undisturbed. Planes still landed, families still reunited. But for one man, the runway had ended. And justice for once arrived not with applause but with a silent badge, placed on a table, and left behind. Here is the script for the 11th section. Devon drew again. But this time the scene was different. The morning after the internal hearing, the sun rose over Atlanta with an unusual softness, a kind that didn't just signal a new day. It whispered of a new chapter. In the quiet of their home, far from camera flashes and courtroom doors, Devon sat at the kitchen table, sketchbook open before him, head slightly bowed in focus. He didn't hum like he used to. There was no music playing, no television blaring, just the whisper of pencil on paper. Shaq watched from the hallway, unseen, holding a mug of coffee gone cold. He didn't interrupt. He had learned to let Devon's creativity bloom in silence. After weeks of tension and testimony, his son had returned to the page, not to escape, but to reclaim. This drawing was different. There were no planes this time, no engines or wings. Instead, the page bore two figures, tall and small. A man and a boy, standing hand in hand in front of a tall courthouse building. The figures weren't cartoonish or abstract. They were careful, exact, emotionally rich. The larger figure's shoulders were squared, posture confident. The boy's gaze was upward, proud. Behind them, the courthouse had flags, steps, and people in the background, not jurors or police, but ordinary faces watching. Devon titled the piece quietly in the bottom corner, "We Didn't Run." Shaq stepped into the kitchen, eyes fixed on the page. Devon glanced up, a little startled, then relaxed. "You did that just now?" Shaq asked, voice gentle. Devon nodded, closing the sketchbook halfway. Shaq sat down slowly, pushing his coffee aside. "Can I see it?" Devon opened the page again and pushed it across the table. Shaq looked for a long time, not just at the shapes or lines, but the emotion etched into each pencil stroke. He blinked, once, then again, but he didn't wipe the tear that slid down his cheek. "You see how strong he looks?" Devon said, tapping the bigger figure. "I do," Shaq whispered, "but he's not the only strong one in that drawing." Devon looked down, then up again, quieter now. "It's us." Shaq nodded. "It's exactly us." The sketchbook became more than a drawing. It became a message. Shaq knew that this image, the realness of it, the quiet defiance, carried more power than 1,000 speeches. He snapped a photo of it, with Devon's permission, and shared it on his foundation's social media, with a single caption. "My son's voice doesn't shout. It sketches. This is what justice looks like to him." Within hours, it spread. Artists reposted it. Activists, educators, even civil rights groups reshared it with admiration. Comments flooded in. "This belongs in a museum." Tears. "So powerful. Your son's art is the revolution." The image reached news outlets without being sold, without being staged. It traveled because of its truth. Even those who had remained quiet during the initial storm now spoke. Major art journals requested interviews. Youth programs wanted Devon to speak. Art academies offered workshops and mentorships. But Shaq made sure one thing stayed clear. Devon wasn't a tool for change. He was the reason for it. They turned down commercial offers, declined licensing deals. Instead, they launched a new initiative called Sketchbook Stories, a program through the foundation that encouraged young kids, especially black and brown youth, to draw their truth, whatever it looked like. The mission was simple. If you can't find the words, pick up a pencil. Shaq took the original drawing and had it framed. It hung now in the foundation's main office, just outside his own door. Visitors often stopped in front of it longer than expected. Some took photos, others just stood still. It had become a quiet shrine, not to victory, but to vulnerability. Devon, for all the attention, remained grounded. He still went to school, still came home to basketball and math homework. But he drew more now, not always with purpose. Sometimes just clouds, trees, crowds. But every once in a while, another truth slipped onto the page. Shaq would find sketches in the margins of his son's notebooks. A boy giving a speech to a small crowd. A pilot handing his badge to a little girl. An airport terminal, with signs that read "Safe for All." Each sketch told a story that words couldn't always shape. Shaq never pushed. Never asked Devon to turn his drawings into anything other than what they were, reflections of his heart. One evening, as they watched the sunset from the back porch, Devon asked, "Did you cry because of the drawing?" Shaq nodded. "I did." "Why?" "Because I saw us," he said. "Not just what we've been through, but what we've become." Devon leaned back in his chair. "I think I'll draw something happier next time." Shaq smiled. "You draw whatever's true." The sky turned golden behind them. No reporters, no hearings, just father and son, and the sketchbook that started it all, reopened, reclaimed, and now rewritten with hope. Here is the full, 1,500-word script for the final section. Airports aren't just places for planes. They're checkpoints for prejudice. Airports, by their design, are meant to move people forward. Gates, jet bridges, terminals. They're transitions, not destinations. But for Shaquille O'Neal, those glossy floors and numbered doors had come to mean something else entirely. Not just movement, not just departure. They were metaphors now, for assumptions, for barriers, for battles that most people never saw, but that he and his son had walked through with eyes wide open. The morning they flew again, weeks after Preston's license was revoked, felt different. The media had settled. The interviews paused. The heat of the headlines had cooled. But the memory was still warm, simmering beneath Shaq's skin. This time they were flying out of LAX, headed to DC for a formal campaign launch. A campaign with a name Devon chose himself. Clear the Gate. It wasn't just a slogan, it was a declaration. The campaign was designed to bring bias awareness into the heart of airport culture. It would train airline staff, TSA agents, flight crews, and security personnel on the silent signals they often missed, or misread. But it wouldn't stop at stat. It would include educational materials for passengers, visual art installations in terminals curated by young artists of color, and storytelling hubs to collect real travel stories, like Devon's. Not viral clips, human truths. It was the first initiative of its kind, and it bore Devon's name on every banner. Shaq had funded it himself, with quiet backing from partners who didn't want credit. Just change. He didn't need to be the face of it. He was its spine. But Devon was its heart. Inside the terminal, Devon walked beside his father, dressed simply in jeans and a long-sleeve shirt. His sketchbook was slung across his shoulder. He didn't hold Shaq's hand anymore. He didn't need to. But Shaq kept one eye on him. Always. Just enough to remind himself, this was who it had all been for. They passed a digital screen that read, "Clear the Gate, a national campaign for safe, bias-free travel, founded in honor of Devon O'Neal." Passengers slowed as they passed. Some nodded. Others took photos. A few whispered, but none stared with suspicion. No security shadowed their steps. No whispers curled behind them like smoke. For once they moved through a terminal as they were meant to. Not as profiles but as passengers. Shaq stopped briefly at a mural installation, a composite of drawings submitted by kids across the country. A girl had drawn her mother sitting in a security line, A boy had drawn himself hugging a TSA officer, and in the center Devon's original sketch was etched into digital glass. Him and Shaq in front of the courthouse, titled simply "We Didn't Run." A woman nearby wiped her eyes. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. As they waited at the gate, Devon flipped his sketchbook open. Shaq glanced over and saw what was taking shape. A new drawing. This one was inside the airport. But it wasn't tense or sterile. There were kids laughing. A pilot crouching to take a picture with them. And in the background, a sign that read, "Everyone flies equal." Shaq didn't interrupt. He watched. Proud. Silent. When their boarding group was called, Shaq rose with Devon, and they moved to the gate. No alarms, no confrontation, no wrong assumptions. But before they stepped onto the jet bridge, Shaq paused. He turned slightly, looking back at the terminal, not at the people, but at the path they'd walked. It struck him how simple it looked. Just a polished floor, glass walls, overhead announcements echoing distant boarding calls. But beneath it was a different story. Beneath it were years, no, generations, of silence, suspicion, and the need to just get through. Now they weren't just passing through, they were changing it. As they entered the jet bridge, Devon turned to him. "You think people will remember?" Shaq smiled. "They already are. Because airports aren't just spaces for flights. They're proving grounds. They test patience. They test perception. And now they would also carry a new kind of checkpoint. One that asked not for your boarding pass, but for your willingness to see each traveler as they are. Not a profile. Not a threat. Just a person. The gate we all must pass isn't marked by numbers. It's marked by choices. And today father and son walked through it. Not as suspects but as symbols of what happens when someone stands tall, and when a child picks up a pencil and draws the truth. If this story moved you, if it made you pause, reflect, or see things differently, then let's keep the conversation alive. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that challenge perspectives and give voice to the unheard. Like this video if you believe in standing up with calm strength, like Big Shaq, and share it with someone who needs to see what quiet courage really looks like. Because awareness begins with a story, but change begins when we spread it.